So, hi everyone, welcome to tonight's Devon Dark Skies Week webinar. So this is an introduction to moths and their decline with Richard Fox, who's from Butterfly Conservation. So it's really amazing to see so many of you here this evening. That's absolutely fantastic. Definitely the most we've had in a webinar so far. But just before I hand over to Richard, we just got a bit of housekeeping to just remind you all of. So obviously we're just asking that everybody keeps themselves on mute for the duration of Richard's presentation, but obviously feel free to keep your videos on. It makes it much more fun. And also we're recording this webinar, as you probably just heard. So if you do have to pop out or leave, you will be able to watch it back on our YouTube channel. Probably will go live sometime next week. Not sure if our comms team have a lot to do at the moment. But yeah, after Richard's presentation, we'll open for questions. So you can do this throughout the presentation by typing them into the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function at the end while we're in the questions. And when you're asked to do so, you can unmute yourself and actually ask the question yourself. So that's everything from me. So I'll hand over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Kat. I'm just letting some more people in, but I'll let you take over with that. I will close that. Right, and I will share my screen. Right, hopefully everyone can see that. Is that looking okay? Yes, brilliant, thanks. The great online talk thumbs up works every time. Thanks for that. And yeah, brilliant to have so many people along here tonight. So thanks very much for giving up a little bit of your evening to come and learn a bit about moths. So I'm going to be talking about moths. I'm going to do a bit of a general introduction for those of you who don't know much at all about moths. I expect there's probably quite a wide range of people in the audience, some of whom, there are certainly some people in the audience who are moth experts, I've already spotted. So they can sort of doze off for the first sort of 5-10 minutes or so. So yeah, bit of general introduction about moths. Then a little bit about how moths are faring in the UK, how they're doing, and also why we should care about that. And then the sort of latter part of the talk, I'm going to focus on the effects of light pollution on moths so far as we know, including some recent research that I was involved with. First thing to say, though, is that you may be aware, if you sort of saw the early adverts for this evening's webinar, that this was meant to be a double bill. Myself and Douglas Boyes, who's been involved in some of the recent light pollution research that I'm going to talk about. Very sadly and tragically, Douglas passed away about 2 weeks ago, which is a huge loss to the butterfly and moth recording community and the scientific world as well. Is a great loss to many of us. So I'm afraid you're going to have to put up just with me this evening. So I'm going to start with some really general stuff, some basics about moths, as I said. So what are moths? Well, moths are insects, of course, in the order Lepidoptera. So this is butterflies and moths together form this big insect group, the Lepidoptera. And Lepidoptera means scale wing. And that is a very apt name for the moths and butterflies, because for the vast majority of species, their wings are covered with these little tiny scales. So if we zoom in on a very small moth, like this little Phyllonoricta moth, you can actually start to see the individual scales of different colors that make up the patterns on its wing. And if we look under a microscope, you can see that the scales on the wings of moths and butterflies are like tiles on a roof. And these are responsible for giving all of the amazing colors and patterns that we see on the wings of moths and butterflies. The scales are also, as it happens, responsible for that kind of dusty stuff that you get on your hands if you help a moth or a butterfly out of the house, and you sort of see this sort of dusty stuff on your fingertips. That's the scales rubbing off their wings. Now, I've mentioned butterflies, so let's deal with a question that comes up all the time about the relationship between butterflies and moths. I'm just going to minimize that so that I'm not, yeah, okay, sorry, that's probably hasn't changed anything for you, but it's changed my view a little bit. So yes, people often ask, well, what's the difference between, or another way of putting it, what's the relationship between butterflies and moths? Now, this extremely complicated looking diagram is a family tree of the Lepidoptera, starting with the sort of more primitive things down here and going all the way around to more advanced insects around here. And there are the butterflies, nestled right in the middle of the Lepidoptera family tree. So the simple, and honest, if rather difficult to take and digest answer is that butterflies are simply a type of moth. Now, Lepidoptera are a really big and important group in terms of global biodiversity. If we just think about the described species, so the known knowns, these are species that are known to science. They have names. There are specimens of them in a museum somewhere. There are about 5,500 species of mammals in the world. There are about 10,000 species of birds, but there are 174,000 species of Lepidoptera, mainly moths and butterflies. Now, there's also the unknowns. So the scientists are sure that there are lots of other species that we don't currently know about, we haven't described, we haven't named yet in the world. And they've estimated the numbers of these additional species, or what they would add to the totals. So here are the revised totals, including the species that we're yet to discover. For mammals, it makes no difference at all. We think we've pretty much got all the mammals. There may be quite a lot of extra birds. These will generally not be completely new species or species that look very different, hiding away in the jungle or on a mountaintop somewhere, but actually are probably mainly going to be cryptic species. So we look out the window and we see a blackbird and all the blackbirds look the same, but actually with DNA analysis, we may eventually learn that actually there are 3 different species of blackbirds, but we just can't tell them apart with our eyes. I just picked blackbirds as a random example. That's not necessarily true. But when it comes to the moths and butterflies, the Lepidoptera, maybe as many as 500,000 species in the world. So they're a really big, important part of our global biodiversity. Now, if we just go back, just to put those big numbers in a slightly easier form, of more visual form to digest, hopefully. If we go back to the ones we do know about, the species with names, for every 100 animal species on Earth, 3 of them are vertebrates, the mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians. 29 of them are beetles. 12 of them are butterflies and moths. 11 are flies. 8 are Hymenoptera, that's the bees, wasps, and ants, and 7 are spiders. And then the remainder will be all of the rest of the animals, which is mostly other types of insects, but also the crustacea, the crabs and prawns and so on, the mollusks, all of the snails and the seashells, and worms, and all sorts of other animals. So Lepidoptera make up a really important part of the world's wildlife. Now, while we're talking generally about moths, let's deal with some of the common misconceptions, the moth myths. It's a great tongue twister to check that I'm properly awake. So these are things that come up all of the time. You may share some of these misunderstandings yourself. You certainly will have heard other people express them, but hopefully after a quick run through, you'll be able to put people right the next time you hear these kind of things expressed. So myth number 1, moths eat my clothes. All moths are terrible, hideous things because they come into our houses and they eat our clothes and other fabrics. The reality is that there are really only 2 moth species of all the different species that occur in the UK that do this: the case-bearing clothes moth and the common clothes moth. And actually, it's not the moths that do the damage at all, it's their caterpillars. And this one, the caterpillar of the case-bearing clothes moth, not only eats holes in your clothes, but has the audacity to build itself a little house out of the fibers that it's shredded out of your favorite jumper. So obviously this is not good news, but it is only these 2 species out of the huge wealth of moths that occur in the UK, the vast majority of which don't eat clothes. So I'm going to give that a false. I should also point out that even those 2 species that do have caterpillars that attack fabrics, they only feed on fabrics on textiles of animal origin. So wool, obviously, also feathers and fur. They don't feed on cotton and they don't feed on synthetic fabrics either. So if you've got holes in your cotton t-shirts or in synthetic fabrics, you can't pin that on the moths, I'm afraid. So the second of my moth myths is that moths only fly at night. Well, yeah, we all know that. Obviously, moths fly at night, butterflies fly during the day. But of course, it's not true. There are many species of moths that fly in the day, including these 2 beautiful species here. This one, the lunar hornet moth, is a hornet mimic, flies around in the daytime, buzzing merrily, just to fool every would-be predator that it is in fact a hornet and shouldn't be messed with. And this wonderful emperor moth, which you can see out on the moors, out on Dartmoor and Exmoor, in various other parts of Devon, and indeed other parts of Britain as well. So lots of moths fly during the day. One estimate was that maybe as many as 480 species of moths in the UK fly during the daytime, which is far more than our 60 or so species of butterflies. So some moths fly at night, yes, of course they do, but lots of moths also fly in the daytime. And then the third and the worst of all, in my opinion, of all the moth myths, is this idea that somehow moths are dull and brown and boring, and yet butterflies are beautiful and colourful and amazing creatures. So here's our most abundant butterfly in Britain and in Devon as well, the meadow brown. And here's certainly one of our most abundant moths, the large yellow underwing. Okay, they're both quite brown and quite dull looking. I wouldn't say they're boring, they're wonderful animals, but you know, there's not a huge amount separating those 2, I wouldn't have said. And then there are these moths, all of which are common and widespread. You can find these in your garden if you go looking for them at night with a suitable light, or out in the wider countryside, again across Devon, across the UK more widely. And these are just 4 examples of many. You'll see other pictures in my talk tonight that I hope will absolutely, once and for all, dispel this myth that moths are dull and boring. Okay, that's getting a big false. Okay, so moving on then. I'm going to come on in a minute to talking about how our moths are doing. But before I do that, I want to just explain to you why I think it's important. Because, you know, otherwise, why should you care how moths are doing, whether they're doing well, whether they're doing badly? So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes, hopefully convincing you that it's important and we should care about how moths are doing in the UK and indeed elsewhere in the world. And there are 2 main reasons. One, as I've already sort of illustrated, I hope, in terms of global biodiversity, moths are also a really important part of our wildlife here in the UK. So we have over 2,500 species of moths recorded in Britain. moths are very crudely divided into micro moths, the little ones, and macro moths, the generally larger ones. But in total, don't worry too much about that. In total, over 2,500 species. So they're a big chunk of our native wildlife. And that's true in Devon as well. Over 1,700 species of moths have been recorded in Devon. So they're a really big, important part of our wildlife at local and national scales. The second reason is that moths play an important part in the environment. They play a number of important roles in the environment. I'm just going to highlight two of them. The first is as food for a huge variety of other creatures. So this skylark here, with its moth caterpillar in its beak that it's probably going to feed to its young in the nest, illustrates the point that many of our birds, including most of our garden birds, rely on moth caterpillars and other insects to raise their young. And then, of course, there are other species, like things like nightjar, and indeed many of our larger bat species, which are specialist hunters of adult moths, moths flying at night. So there's big fluffy animals that we know and love that depend to a greater or lesser extent on moths, and particularly on moth caterpillars. But then there's also a huge diversity of other creatures, particularly parasitic wasps and flies, of which there's an enormous abundance of species that are entirely dependent on moths and butterflies, because they lay their eggs into the eggs, caterpillars and pupae of our moths and butterflies, and without them they couldn't exist. Those myriad species of wasps and flies could not exist. So they're really important part of the food chain. And moths are also increasingly recognized as important pollinators. They've got off to a slow start in this. We all know that day-flying insects, particularly things like hoverflies and bees, are important pollinators, and indeed they are. It's much easier to study insects visiting flowers in the daytime, in daylight, than it is to observe what's going on after dark. But there have been a number of studies recently showing that lots of moths visit flowers. Many moths are carrying pollen around on their bodies at night and presumably pollinating plants. We know that some of our wildflowers, like the butterfly orchid shown in the picture there, are exclusively pollinated by moths at night. And this weird picture over here, this close-up of this small elephant hawk moth with these strange things attached to it. These are not part of the moth. These are actually the pollinia of an orchid. So orchids don't have loose pollen like most plants. They have their pollen in these sort of bundles, these special structures called pollinia. And when the moth sticks its head into the orchid flower, these get glued onto its head. And then, of course, the moth goes off to visit another orchid and pollination can occur. Okay. So how are moths doing then in Britain? Let's keep half an eye on the time as well. So let's have a quick rattle through some of that. So 51 moth species have become extinct in Britain since the year 1900. And a further 3 species might also now be extinct. And the example here with the map and the photo is a species called the pale shining brown. On the map, all of the blue and yellow dots show places where pale shining browns were recorded in the past, but not recently. And the few black dots, there are a few appropriately dotted around in there, are the only places where this moth species has been recorded in Britain this century. And in fact, no pale shining browns have been recorded anywhere in Britain since 2017. So we are increasingly concerned that this species might have disappeared. In contrast, many more moth species have actually colonized Britain since the year 1900. 137 species have not only turned up here, but they've actually colonized. They've formed breeding resident populations in Britain. And that rate seems to be increasing over time. So 53 of those species have colonized just this century. Now, we thankfully have a huge amount of data going back sort of at least 50 years or so in Britain, with which we can assess the trends of our resident species, the species that are native to Britain that have been here all along. One of these fantastic sources of information is a thing called the Rothamsted Insect Survey, and that produces counts of moth species. And this plot here shows that the total abundance of moths flying around at night in Britain has declined by 33%, or a third, over the last 50 years. So that's not that there are a third fewer species, it's the total number of adult moths flying around at night has dropped by a third since the late 1960s. And we can split that data up into northern and southern halves of Britain as well. And we find that the trend is even worse in southern Britain, that the total abundance of moths flying around at night has dropped by 39% over 50 years in the southern half of Britain. The decline is also significant in the northern half of Britain as well, although it's not as steep. But nevertheless, there's nearly a quarter fewer moths flying around at night in northern Britain now compared to the late 1960s. So that's moth abundance, clear, strong declines over the last 50 years. Moth distribution shows something quite different. So distribution of a species is how widespread it is, how many different parts of the UK that species occurs in. And this data comes from the National Moth Recording Scheme organised by Butterfly Conservation. And the chart here is a composite of the changing distributions over time for over 500 moth species that we measured over this 50-year period, how widespread they had become, whether they'd become more widespread or less widespread over time. And there was a small but significant increase. So on average, across these over 500 species, on average, the moths have become a bit more widespread over the last 50 years. If we look at the breakdown across the species, then rather than summing everything together onto a single into a single trend or a single chart, when we look at abundance, we find that 4 times as many moth species have decreased in numbers than have increased over the last 50 years. So that's the Rothamsted Insect Survey data. But in terms of their distributions, slightly more species have increased, have become more widespread over the last 50 years than have declined. Okay, here are just a couple of very quick examples of some species, moth species that have done very extreme things over that sort of 50-year period. Here's the V-moth. You can see it used to have a big distribution, used to be widespread, found across many areas, including Devon, and it's undergone a massive decline. So again, all of the blue and yellow dots are places where V-moth used to be found, but it has not been seen for at least 20 years. And the black dots are the places that still record V-moth. In stunning contrast, the buff footman has undergone a massive increase in its distribution over the same sort of time period. On this map, the purple dots show where buff footman occurred in last century, sort of in the latter part of last century. And the orange dots show all of the new places, all of the new territory that has been colonized by buff footman just over the course of this century. Okay, so what's driving all of these changes? There are some big changes going on there. What are the causes of all of that? So, as is the case for all different sorts of wildlife, really, in the UK, the thing that is suspected to be the main driver of change is our changes to our landscapes. So the replacement of wonderful habitats like this, rich in moths and plants and all sorts of other wildlife, with monocultures of arable crops and pasture and urban development and conifer plantations. So it's very difficult to measure that, but it's clear that these kind of changes in land use will have a really drastic impact on moths, as well as pretty much all other wildlife. Climate change is a big factor as well. Climate change is probably the single biggest factor driving the increasing distributions of moths that we've seen in Britain over the last 50 years or so. Species that are increasing their distribution, becoming more widespread. But we also see negative impacts of climate change as well. There are species that are retreating in the face of the warming climate. And it's perfectly clear that as climate change continues, it's going to have more and more negative impacts on our moths and other wildlife, and indeed on us humans as well. Nutrient enrichment is another potential major driver. So we are pouring out nutrients into the environment, particularly nitrogen. This comes from burning fossil fuels in our cars, in our homes, in our factories, and also from agriculture, from fertilizers applied in agriculture. And this massive increase in nitrogen and other nutrients in the environment is having a big impact on plant communities. It changes the composition, the structure, and even the chemistry, even the internal chemistry of plant communities. And our moths are completely interwoven with the plants. They depend on plants for their caterpillars to feed on. And so when changes happen to plant communities, there are bound to be changes to moth communities as well. I'm not going to talk much about pesticides because, to be honest, we don't know how much of an impact the use of pesticides, both in our domestic gardens and in agriculture, has had in driving the moth trends that I've briefly shown you this evening. Now, obviously, insecticides are designed to kill insects, herbicides are designed to kill plants, and moths are insects and moths rely on plants. So it's hard to imagine that there could be anything other than negative impacts of pesticides on our moth communities, but how significant pesticide use is in driving these trends that I've shown you is still unclear. But what I want to get onto for the remainder of the webinar tonight is light pollution. I think I'm just about doing okay for time. So here's a lovely picture taken from space of Britain and Ireland and a little bit of France at night. Now, it's Devon Dark Skies week. That's why we're here. That's why we're having this webinar. So obviously, I need to talk a bit about light and dark and what impacts it might be having on our moths. So that's what I'll do for the rest of this webinar. So globally, the extent of artificial light at night is increasing by about 2% every year. So every year, 2% more of the world is lit at night compared to the year before. And that's going on year on year on year. Not only that, but the intensity of light is also growing by about 2% every year. So not only is more and more of the world becoming lit at night every year, but the intensity of that lighting is increasing at the same time. And one study estimated that 83% of all humans now live under light polluted skies. It's pretty sobering statistics. So what are the impacts of light, artificial light at night on our moths and indeed other wildlife as well. I'm not going to talk about other wildlife, but you can assume that if there are impacts on moths, there are going to be impacts on all sorts of other creatures that are active at night, including many other types of insects, as well as obviously bats and mammals and other things as well. Now, if I'd been giving this talk about sort of 10 years or so ago, there would have been very little more I could have said. But thankfully, there's been a big growth in research looking at the impacts of artificial light at night on our moths and indeed other wildlife as well over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. I'm going to give you a quick run through, a quick summary of some of that work, culminating in our most recent research that we published just a couple of months ago. So most of the work that's been done so far has looked at effects of artificial light at night on particular aspects of moths' lives. So there are going to be quite a lot of graphs on these next slides, which aren't everyone's cup of tea, but don't worry about that. If you're not into graphs, fine, don't look at the graphs, just look at the pictures of moths, and I will be explaining what's going to happen anyway. But the graphs are useful for me to remind me what I'm meant to be talking about, and obviously, you know, for those of you who love a good graph, especially in colour, then obviously you can relax and enjoy the graphs as well. So in this first study, I'm just going to briefly talk about, this is cabbage moth, this species here. And in this study, they found that female cabbage moths produce a lot less pheromone, sex pheromone, when they're exposed to artificial light at night. So whether they're exposed to green light, white light, or red light, they produce significantly less sex pheromone than when they're in the dark. And sex pheromone is how moths find each other at night in order to mate and therefore reproduce. So it's easy to imagine that this could impact on how many eggs a female moth might be able to lay. This is a moth, might not look like one, but this is a female winter moth, really common species in Devon and indeed across the UK as a whole. The females are flightless. They have these funny little vestiges, just these little sting things here, and the development, hooray, and can affect how they interact with other organisms like flowers that they might be pollinating. But actually, does that really matter? You know, does it matter that a caterpillar grows a bit more slowly because it's being exposed to artificial light at night? That might not matter at all. On the other hand, it might be really important. So from a conservation perspective, you know, we want to know what the impacts of artificial light at night might be on the populations of moths. You know, is this going to be causing moths to decline, or is it just a bit of an irrelevance, really? And so we set out a couple of years ago, and this was the PhD research that Douglas Boyes was working on, butterfly conservation with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and Newcastle University, to try and answer this question: does artificial light at night affect moth populations? And we did this, or Douglas was doing this by picking sites. So he found a whole number of sites, 28 actually in all, across the counties of Oxfordshire, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire in southeast England, where he could compare the moth populations in a piece of habitat, a bit of habitat under existing streetlights, with a very nearby bit of similar habitat with no streetlights. So that's the basic idea. You've got a lit bit of habitat and an unlit bit, and you count the moths there and compare the two. And the sites kind of looked, these were some of the sites, very glamorous places to do your field work, never mind working in, you know, tropical rainforests or on the beaches of Southwest or Southeast Asia. These were the places that Doug went to do his PhD field work. Now, as well as that basic idea of having lit and unlit places to sample moth populations. There were also differences in the street lighting. So these are all places that have got existing street lighting. So it's a real world impacts of existing street lights that have been there for years. At some of the sites, there were the rather old-fashioned now high-pressure sodium lamps, the sort of orangey yellow lamps that we'll all be familiar with. And at other sites, there were the newer LED lights. And these produce rather different light, as you can see just from looking at them, and as you know from your experience of seeing them. The high-pressure sodium lights give out this sort of yellowy orange glow, and they produce very little light at the blue and ultraviolet end of the spectrum. And this is important because this is where moths see. These are the wavelengths that moths are particularly sensitive to. Moths can't see really up at this end of the spectrum. The LED, on the other hand, produces a lot of blue light that moths can see and are highly sensitive to, as well as lots of light in other wavelengths as well. In fact, it's really very similar to daylight. So we've got this. So on top of our sort of fundamental comparison of lit and unlit habitats, we've also got this fact that some of the street lights are high pressure sodium and others are LEDs. And then we've looked at, we've been counting caterpillars. Douglas was counting caterpillars as a way of measuring moth populations at these sites. And he looked at two different types of habitat in these different contrasts. So first of all, he looked at the moths that live in hedgerows, the caterpillars that live in hedgerows. And he did this by whacking hedgerows with a stick in a standardized way and counting the moths that fell out, that were dislodged by his whacking, and counting those up. There are a few moths that have fallen out of that little bit of hedgerow. On other sites where there wasn't a hedgerow, but there was a grassy verge with long grass and wildflowers, he swept through the vegetation using a net, again in a standardized way, and counted up the caterpillars that were collected in the net. And so what did we discover? This is a complicated looking graph, and I'm going to summarize the results much more simply in a moment, so don't worry about it too much at all. But each of the lines, each of the narrow lines on this graph are different sites. So each one of these bars is one of the pairs of sites, one of the sites that has a lit and an unlit sample. And all of the bars that are below this central line, this one line with the value 1, everything that's below there indicates that there were fewer caterpillars under the street light than there were in the dark bits nearby. And similarly, if there are any bars, there are a few bars that are above the line or a little bit above the line, that means there were actually more caterpillars under the street lights than in the dark controls. Anyway, these are the results summarized in a much clearer way. There's a really strong and clear impact of streetlights. So there were 47% fewer caterpillars under the streetlights in total compared to the very similar bits of habitat nearby that did not have streetlights. So the streetlights are causing a decline of almost 50% in the moth population immediately under those streetlights. More than that, the LEDs were worse. So the decline was even greater under the LEDs than it was under the high pressure sodium lamps. For hedgerows, this is, sorry, I'm not sure if I said that or not, but that's the results for hedgerows. The results for the grass margins, very similar. There's a strong, significant overall effect of a third fewer caterpillars under the streetlights compared to the non-lit patches of habitat. And again, the result, the impact was much greater under LED streetlights than under the high pressure sodium ones. Indeed, although there was there were fewer caterpillars counted under the high pressure sodium. It wasn't statistically significant, which is why I've shown it in grey. And we shouldn't give too much importance to this result because it wasn't statistically significant. Doug discovered some other things as part of the work as well. He discovered, intriguingly, that the caterpillars were heavier under street lights. They were heavier under LED lights, both in the hedgerows and on the grassy margins. And they were also heavier under the high pressure sodium street lights on the grassy margins, although not in the hedgerows. And then he did another study, which is also written up in the same paper. So you've got it kind of all there together. And we're doing for time. Okay, not long to go. Where he installed experimental streetlights, that's what you can see in that picture there, over long grassy habitat to see whether the presence of the light would actually disrupt the caterpillar's behavior. So in these long grassy margins, during the daytime, the caterpillars are hiding. They're down sort of at ground level, tucked away amongst the leaf litter and in the tussocks and things, safe from predators. And they only come out at night. They climb up the vegetation to feed. And what Douglas found was that when he illuminated the grassy margins with these fake street lights, that had a big impact, where the LED ones, that had a big impact on the behavior of the caterpillars. So when exposed to LED light, then far, far fewer caterpillars actually came up at night to feed. Okay, the study was published in August this year. It received huge amount of attention worldwide in over 200 different media outlets. It was widely shared on social media, and it's already starting to have some impact. We're already getting some interest from local authorities and indeed from the lighting and from lighting professionals as well, which is fantastic. Next question that pops into my mind and possibly into your minds as well is, okay, so we've shown that there's a really strong impact on the local moth population, the abundance of caterpillars under these street lights. Does that mean that light pollution is driving the declines of moths that we've seen in the UK? And Doug had started to look at this as well. This map shows basically the presence of all of the actual streetlights, the real streetlights in this particular patch of the home counties, and estimating the amount of land that is directly illuminated by those streetlights. And that varies, of course. So in suburban areas up in here, actually the amount of potential moth habitat that is directly illuminated by streetlights could be quite high. It could be maybe, as much as 15%, 15%. So it's not huge, but it's still a fair bit. But obviously out here, there are no streetlights at all. There's no direct illumination going on. And when Doug calculated this across the whole of those 3 counties that he was using as his study area, the total amount of moth habitat, potential moth habitat that was directly illuminated by streetlights was 1%. So it's highly unlikely that direct illumination, serious though it is for moth populations in the immediate vicinity of streetlights, it's highly unlikely that is driving the large national level moth declines that we've seen. But there may well be more to it. And a number of other really recent studies, or some of them very recent, have started. I mean, there's still this just illustrating that there's still an awful lot to discover, basically. So one study has found that there are effects away from the lights. So the presence of lights, artificial light at night, affects the behavior of moths away from the lights as well. This study, actually from the same group of researchers, quite amazingly found that the presence of artificial light at night affects daytime pollination. They don't know why yet. I'm sure they'll be working on that, and other people maybe as well. But there was a clear effect on the pollination being done by daytime insects, bees and hoverflies and things, by the presence of light at night. Perhaps because of impacts on the plants. Plants respond to artificial light at night as well. There's some good evidence that artificial light at night, like street lights, will fragment habitat. It will stop moths moving around patches of countryside, which is generally bad news for wildlife. But there's also the intriguing possibility that moths and other creatures might adapt. So there's been one study so far of this one micro moth, an Eponomuta species, suggesting that the moths had adapted, they'd evolved to be less sensitive to artificial light at night in urban areas compared to out in the dark countryside. Okay, we need some artificial light at night. I mean, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we don't have any light at night. I think it's perfectly clear that some artificial light at night is needed for the security and safety of people, particularly in the context of male violence against women, but also for the safety of road users in some settings. But there may well be things we can do to lessen the impact of artificial light at night on moths and other wildlife. Now, I'm not an expert in this. I'm not a lighting professional. I'm a conservationist and an entomologist and a moth and butterfly enthusiast. So there's a webinar on Thursday night as part of Devon Dark Skies Week, which will focus much more on this side of things. But perhaps just as a little taster for that, these are some of the obvious, easy and relatively, or in many cases, cheap things that we could do. We can shield light so that the light only goes where it's wanted, rather than spilling out into our windows of our houses, for example, and out onto habitats where wildlife is trying to get on with its normal nocturnal life. We can avoid the most harmful wavelengths. And with things like LEDs, that's incredibly easy to do. They're fantastically adaptable technologies, LEDs. So maybe we should be adapting the wavelength to make them have less of an impact on nocturnal wildlife, or filtering the output so that that has the same effect. Many local authorities are already dimming lights, street lights, for example, in the small hours of the night when there's very few people around, very little traffic on the roads, and that obviously saves energy, which is good for the climate emergency, and also is likely to be good for our wildlife. There's been some interesting work done in continental Europe about motion-activated streetlights on roads. So again, in the quieter times of nights, the streetlights aren't on all the time, but they switch on as vehicles approach and then switch off again afterwards. Again, great for energy use and presumably would be much better for wildlife as well. And then, of course, we should think sensibly about whether there is light that we can switch off at night as well. Okay, right, I'm rabbiting on, so I'm going to wind up now. If you want more information, this is the paper that contains that street lighting work that we published in August. It's available online in the journal Science Advances. If you want more information about how moths are faring generally, what's driving the trends, that kind of thing, I would refer you to the State of Britain's Larger Moths report that we published earlier this year, which is freely available on the Butterfly Conservation website. And if you're in Devon or you're interested in the moths of Devon particularly, you want to find out more, you want to get involved in recording moths and coming out on field meetings once COVID permits, then I'd point you towards the Devon Moth Group website. Okay, quick thanks then to any and all of you who send in moth records, which helps to inform a lot of this work, to my scientific collaborators in the street lighting work, and particularly Douglas, and to these people whose wonderful images I've used tonight. And that, hopefully, is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's fantastic. I would have put my camera on. Apparently my connection is really unstable, so hopefully this is just about working. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, pop them in the chat, or you can equally use the raise hand function, and we can ask some questions to Richard. So James has said, I wonder how moth declines compare to insects in general. There seems to have been huge declines, especially over the last 20 plus years.
Yes, so that's a really good question. And in some ways, we can think of butterflies and moths certainly in Britain, in the UK, as being sort of brilliant indicators for that much wider wealth of insect diversity. We have the not only the best data on moths and butterflies in the world in Britain, but we also have much better data on butterflies and moths in Britain than we do on any other insect group. So whilst there have been some really good studies and some really good advances in how a few other insect groups are doing in Britain, bees, for example, and hoverflies, for many insect groups, we just don't know. There just aren't the data going back in time to really understand how they've changed. Certainly not in the sort of level of detail that we can for moths and butterflies. So yeah, generally the picture is pretty bad, and the declines we've seen of moths that I've shown you tonight, and butterflies very similar, are indicative of declines across many insect groups. There have been clear studies showing declines of insects in some other parts of Western Europe, and to a lesser extent in North America as well. Lesser extent, not necessarily in terms of the severity of the declines, but in terms of the number of studies. Beyond that, we don't know. So sadly, there's very little data from the tropics, which is where the vast majority of insect biodiversity occurs. Also where there's a huge amount, sadly, of land use change going on, a lot of forestry, a lot of forest destruction, fires and clearance of forest. And also, of course, where climate change may have very drastic effects as well. But I'm seeing lots of things popping into the chat, so I'll shut up now and let someone else ask something.
Yes, so we have a question from Heather, who says, is there...
Lost you there, Kat.
I think my connection is pretty unstable.
Yeah. Try again.
I don't know. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I might just have to mute myself and let you take over the chat, Richard.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'll open the chat and see what I can find. Sorry, I haven't had time to look at these because I've been talking to you. So I'm going to take them in reverse order, I'm afraid, just because that'll be the quickest way of doing it. So Bridget, hi Bridget, asks, maybe a silly question, but why are moths attracted to light? Well, we don't know is a simple answer to that. So if anyone wants to potentially win themselves a Nobel Prize in the decades to come, then we don't know why insects are attracted to light. It's not just moths. There are lots of insects attracted to light. In my moth trap, which uses light to harmlessly attract moths so that I can record them and then release them, I get beetles, flies, wasps, bees, butterflies, even dragonflies occasionally. So lots of insects are attracted to light. There have been various theories, but I won't spend ages explaining them all because none of them really hold water. And the best answer is that we don't know. Okay, thanks for that, Bridget. Julie asks, must we concentrate on planting the same plants for moths as we do for other pollinators in our gardens? That's a good question. Yes and no, I would say. moths will visit the same plants or many of the same plants that are good sources for nectar for butterflies. So plants that you grow for flowers to attract butterflies will generally also be attractive to moths, particularly day-flying moths, but also nocturnal moths. There are specific plants that you can grow that are so-called night-scented plants that release their perfume, their scent at night, like honeysuckle is a good example of that. And these are specifically adapted to attract nocturnal pollinators, as well as producing a wonderful scent on a warm summer's evening. But actually, I would say from a conservation perspective, the best thing you can do in your gardens for moths and other pollinators is to rewild a bit, to let some of your garden be a bit wilder. So even if that's just a bit at the bottom of the garden next to the shed or the back of the flower beds or a bit of your lawn or whatever it might be, the wilder you can let your garden go while still enjoying it, the better that will be for moths and all pollinators. Okay, hope that helps. So this is, who's this? This is Jenny with an I. Were the graphs saying that green light at night is the worst culprit? No, not always. It might have been on some of those studies. And generally, most of those studies, the ones I can think of anyway, tended to compare green, white, and red light with dark. But actually, we know it's very clear that the light that moths are most attracted to is ultraviolet, and following that sort of blue and green sort of spectrum light. So yes, red is likely to be much less impacting on moths, but of course that may not be true for other wildlife. So, bats have completely different type of vision. Being mammals, they have a completely different type of vision to insects. And so we need to look at things in the round. Right, Kat, I know you've put yourself on mute, but do come in and tell me to shut up when you actually want to stop the meeting. Otherwise, I'm just going to go on and on and on until everyone's gone home. No, you're all at home already. Haha. Okay. Who's this? Stevie. Stevie has asked what my thoughts are on LED coloured lights used for decoration in the gardens, if it has any effect. It's interesting. I don't know is the answer, but I think we should assume that any light at night will have an impact. It may not have a major impact, but it's likely to have some impact. So be sparing. Stay away from those bluey kind of colors, that end of the spectrum, the blue-green end of the spectrum. I doubt very much you'd be lighting up your garden with ultraviolet because we can't see it and it's quite dangerous to humans. But yeah, so moderation. If you rewild parts of your garden so that the vegetation is taller and more structured, then insects and other things living in that vegetation will be more protected from your light as well, of course, because there'll be more shadow. Is that Sammy or Fraser or both? I'm not sure. Or Sammy Fraser, sorry, don't know. What about moth and insect casualties to lighting? Yeah, I didn't cover that. There have been studies showing that there can be quite high mortality of individual moths and insects at lights. That can be down to the direct impact of the lights. Many lights are hot. Less so nowadays. LEDs are not hot when they run, but some of the big lamps that are used to light up buildings and so on can, or certainly used to be, very hot and will kill moths and other insects that are attracted to them. The other mortality effect of lights is that it affects predators. So bats learned to hunt around streetlights when streetlights were first introduced. When gas lights were introduced to Britain in the early part of the 20th century, or even the late part of the 19th century, naturalists immediately noticed bats learning to forage around the gas lights because moths and other insects were attracted. So there are those impacts as well. Again, though, it comes back to my question that doesn't necessarily matter unless the loss of those insects has an impact on the overall population. So, obviously it's not nice if moths are being killed by hot lights, lighting up your local church or landmark or whatever it might be. But that's not great. But from a conservation perspective, that might not really matter. That might not actually affect their population. There are, insects have very big populations. Female moths can produce, 300 to 500 eggs. They can produce a lot of offspring when the conditions are right. And the vast majority of those offspring are going to die. They're going to be food for birds. They're going to be prey to parasitic wasps or diseases or whatever. So, yeah, right. How are we doing for time? Oh, it's gone 8 now. Okay, I'm coming back down to the start. I'm just going to check whether Kat sent me any messages saying, shush, stop, please let people go home. So here's one from Robert. Have rewilding activities in the UK seen a reversal in the decline of moths? Well, no, not that we've been able to measure, but it's got to be good. It's got to be a good thing. As long as the habitats that are being rewilded, the places that are being rewilded are poor for biodiversity, are poor for wildlife. So if we take a wonderful nature reserve with beautiful grassland that's filled with natural wildflowers and insects, and we abandon it, we rewild it by just letting it go, and it turns into a scrub of blackthorn and gorse and bramble, and then 30 years later is a woodland, that's not going to be good. We're going to lose rare species of plants, of insects, of moths. But if we take, intensive farmland, if we take our gardens and our parks and we allow parts of those to rewild, then that's got to be fantastic news for moths and other things. And I would hope, rewilding is quite a new thing. It's great to see it taking off. And I would hope that there'll be, if I was giving you this talk in 10 years time, I'd hope I'd be able to cite a whole bunch of scientific studies that have been done to show those benefits of rewilding. Okay. Coming back down. Okay, these are just people saying thanks and goodbye. What else have we got? Sorry. This is where it slows it down if I have to read the things. Okay, I've gone back up into the questions I've already done now. Yeah, someone, Heather asked, then maybe this is coming back to what Kat was going to ask before she got really cut off by her bandwidth, because she was going to ask a question from Heather, which was also about predators taking advantage of lighting in their hunting strategies, which I think I've covered now. They definitely do that. And not just nocturnal predators. I mentioned bats, but also daytime predators like birds will extend their foraging into the nighttime when there is light available, and light that mimics daylight, like LEDs, like many of the LEDs do, is probably going to be particularly helpful to bird predators from that perspective. Okay, I think that might be it, actually. Sorry if I've missed anything. Someone said, can I do this talk in 10 years time? Yes, I'd be very happy to. That'd be good. Okay, Kat, I don't know whether you're there at all and whether you want to come back in. Sounds like not. So I will just bid you good night then. Thanks very much for coming along. Great to have so many people here. Hope it's been useful. Sorry I've gone over time a bit, but that's, I'm blaming you lot for asking so many questions. Not me blabbing on. Definitely not. Definitely wasn't that. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the rest of Devon Dark Skies week. And yeah, okay. Good night.